All right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome into our study time this morning. Glad to see all of you here today. We have a lot to get to today. There's a lot going on in the section that we read for today. So we'll get started with a word of prayer and then dive into our work together. God, we give you thanks for this day and this time to be together and to study your word. Be with us today as we talk about themes of discipleship and service, ways that we can honor you through the work we do through our church and through other aspects of our lives. It's you that we dedicate this time to today, and we welcome your presence with us this morning. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. I didn't have in my notes really any pertinent questions that we had from last week that we didn't answer. I think the only thing I had in my notes was a question about whether or not Luke might have been from Macedonia. That came up when Paul had the dream about going to Macedonia, and traditionally Luke is said to have been from Antioch. So there you go. Fair enough.
We covered that, Brian.
All right. I think that's as close as we're going to get. So, right. So as I said, a lot going on in the chapters 19 through 24 that we're going to look at today.
Bible falling apart.
So what I'm going to try to do is go through and hit a couple points here and there, but I really want to focus on two particular sections. One is in chapter 20, and that's Paul's address to the elders from the church in Ephesus. And then I want to look a little more closely at Paul's time in Jerusalem with the council in front of the religious leaders there and his interaction with the Romans and so forth. So as we go along, if something pops up that you have a question about or that I skip over that you want to talk about, please interrupt and we'll have that conversation. But if we start looking in chapter 19, which is on page 175, we start with Paul in Ephesus.
It's quite a journey, though, from Antioch to Ephesus. I mean, you know.
It is, yeah. If you, again, looking at those maps, it just gives you more of a sense of, how extensive his travels were. And to think about, well, for example, it tells us in Acts 19 that Paul and his companions stayed in Ephesus and taught for 2 years. We talked last time, I think, about, had a conversation about how long, each of these visits might have been to these different communities in which Paul was planting churches, and we talked about the fact that, he often they'd be integrated in the community. They would find work, they would find relationship and so forth among the people. And so it's hard to say if the 2 years would have, well, probably isn't practical for every place that it said that he went, that he stayed for 2 years. It would make him a very, very old man. But it does give us a sense, he didn't just hop on the plane and show up and stay for a week and then go home. This was a significant investment of time of his life in fostering these young churches. So a couple things to notice about Ephesus, other than just the fact, the longevity that he was there, the connection that he has. If you remember, there's, his letter to the Ephesians is a pretty significant text in the New Testament as well. He cared a lot about that church and that community. One of the things that Luke tells us about in Acts, in chapter 19, is some of the things that happened in Ephesus while he was there. And they're miracles or miraculous type events that take place connected with Paul, but they're very similar to things that we could find in the Gospels connected with Jesus. For example, if I can write down which verse this was in. Yeah, so if you look on page 176, starting in verse 11, it says, God was performing unusual miracles through Paul. Even handkerchiefs and aprons he had used were taken to those who were ill, and their diseases were driven away, and the evil spirits would go out of them. So, I guess what I want to start with is just one, noting in verse 11 what the formulation is again of who really is doing the work. It's not Paul, it's God. And we talked a couple of sessions ago about the importance in the work that Paul did in deflecting credit, as it were, from him. He was not capable of doing those things, only capable because the Holy Spirit was with him, that he was able to do those things. And so we continue to see the ways that he sort of directs that power, that he's able to use that power. If you want to look back, I'm going to draw some parallels to stuff going on in Luke's gospel. If you want to look back on page 88, there is the story of the woman that was healed by touching Jesus' cloak. Yeah. It's the woman that had suffered from bleeding for 12 years. This is down in verse 43. She came up in the crowd behind Jesus and touched the edge of his cloak, and her bleeding stopped at once. Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" So I think what Luke is, as an author here, is doing is drawing this parallel between Paul and Jesus. And so what I invite you to kind of pay attention to as we go through our discussion today is the ways in which Luke is making, I think, these pretty direct connections with the actions of Jesus, that Paul is doing the same thing, that Luke really sets up Paul as sort of a, I don't want to say a successor to Jesus, that he's not setting him up as an equal to Jesus, but certainly sees him as sort of a fulfillment of Jesus' call on the disciples, the work that Paul's doing, the way that he's doing it, the miracles that he's able to perform, all of those sorts of things point to that. So we're going to do a little back and forth today, just kind of looking at things Paul does, things that Jesus does, and what those connections are. So the fact people are healed by just touching clothing, not even through a direct action of Paul, just as that story about the woman being healed by Jesus. Jesus didn't actively reach out to heal her, she touched him, and in doing so received healing. So that's one. another thing that's going on in Ephesus is that evil spirits know who Paul is. So again, in chapter 19, it's talking about the sons of the Jewish high priest that were essentially, sounds like performing exorcisms in the name of Paul, in the name of Jesus. And the Spirit says to them, I know Jesus and I know about Paul, but who are you? Now, in and of itself, that's kind of an odd little snippet. But if you turn back to page 81, this is in Luke chapter 4, starting in verse 31. Actually, starting in verse 33, in the synagogue was a man who had the spirit of an evil demon in him. He screamed out in a loud voice, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? I know who you are God's holy messenger." And so I think this reference here probably draws back on that earlier one. Jesus doesn't appear to identify himself to the possessed man or the spirit, but the spirit, the demon, knows who he's dealing with, that this is Jesus. And so there's a parallel in that as well. So then, as is often his effect on communities he lives in, Paul causes a riot. What was the reason for the uprising in Ephesus?
Well, the silversmith had been making models of the temple of Artemis,
Yeah,
and he thought his trade was going to be affected.
yes, yeah. So this is another in those series of stories in Acts where we see religious practice put up against economic concerns. And people are fine Paul doing his thing as long as it doesn't cost them any money. You know, we talked, I think last time was the story about the possessed servant girl who could tell fortunes, and Paul healed her. And so she was free, but she lost the income for her owners, and that prompted them to put charges up against Paul and Silas. So we see kind of a similar thing at work here. And probably not just the silversmith, but probably in general, because of the speech that the town clerk gives at the end, I think makes it pretty clear. It sounds like they have quite a tourism economy around their temple of Artemis, and people who come and stay in the hotels and eat at the restaurants. You know, I mean, it sounds almost kind of contemporary, and Paul's presence and teaching is threatening that model, and so it creates difficulty. But actually, right at the beginning of that section, in verse 21, this is still in chapter 19, we read, after these things had happened, Paul made up his mind to travel through Macedonia and Achaia and go on to Jerusalem. So again, a small detail, but what does that remind us of? Or does it remind us of anything?
Jesus before Easter.
Yeah. Jesus, and the reference in Luke, you can find it on page 91. Sorry for all the flipping back and forth, but I think it's interesting to make these comparisons. This would be Luke chapter 9, verse 51. As the time drew near, when Jesus would be taken up to heaven, he made up his mind and set out on his way to Jerusalem. So again, we have this connection between actions of Paul and the actions of Jesus. All right. So, he leaves Ephesus, probably escorted out of Ephesus, I would imagine. And he moves on to Troas. And I guess maybe it's the preacher in me that finds so much humor in this little story. But what happens in Troas? He's visiting a house church there. What happens?
Somebody falls
Stays
asleep.
so long. Someone falls asleep.
You fell asleep and fell out the window.
Paul preaches so long, and it doesn't say if he was like Billy Graham or not, I don't know, but he preaches so long that the young man sitting on the window falls asleep and falls out of a third floor window and dies. And so Paul stops and runs downstairs and says, oh, there's still life in him, and he comes back to life. And then he goes back up and starts preaching again.
It's sunrise.
Well, you haven't got to the point.
He hadn't got to the point.
He didn't go to the denouement.
So, I mean, it's funny, it's not funny, but, you know, I try not to preach that long. I hope, I know I've put people to sleep before, but no one's fallen out of a building that I'm aware of, so,
There's also a change of tense again here, or person.
yes, yeah,
Because at the end of 20, you get down to we rather than they.
yes,
It says we sailed from Philippi, after they had they, and then we, up until we, and then
that's right,
it changes again.
that's right. Well, and remember, I think there were 4 different sections where it kind of comes and goes, the we part in the narrative. So, yeah, so things are moving, things are changing. The one other thing that I would just say about that short little story in Troas is, at the end of that little section in verse 12, in chapter 20, right before it, after talking with them for a long time, even until sunrise, Paul left. They took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. And the cynic in me wants to say that that's part of the comic relief of this story, and that they were greatly comforted, not because they took the son home, but because Paul finally shut up. I don't know if that's what Luke intended or not, but just one of the ways I think we can read that text. Okay, so we come now to Paul's address to the Ephesian elders. He's in a town called Miletus. I think that's on the map.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And
Carrier.
yeah,
Carrier.
yeah, just kind of left of center there. So Miletus is about 63 kilometers from Ephesus, and probably would have been about a 2-day walk for those elders. The fact that he calls the elders to come to him probably suggests that he was not welcome in Ephesus after the riot that had taken place. But in his speech to them, that starts in chapter 20, verse 17. Anything stand out? Anything sound familiar?
There's danger awaiting him in Jerusalem.
Yeah. Which again sounds like the warnings that Jesus repeatedly gave his disciples. Yeah. Well, and specifically that particular phrase that he used sort of echoes the language Jesus used when they go out to Gethsemane and are praying that night. Yeah. What else? Well, he starts off and he tells them it's the last time he will ever see them, which probably had to get their attention. He teaches in this speech, which is sort of staged like some of the other series of important speeches we've seen through Acts in terms of Peter's speeches at Pentecost and Peter had several of them. Paul's had a few of them. There have been other significant moments of speaking and teaching that have happened. And so I think the whole point about Paul telling them this is the last time I will ever see you kind of immediately should clue us into the fact that what he's going to say is, I mean, this is it. This is his last chance to, impart wisdom on them. So he talks a lot about the nature of servant leadership. And he talks about, servant leadership draws back to a lot of the allusions in this section draw back to the Last Supper. So he talks a lot about servant leadership. And in the Last Supper, we don't always remember it this way, but what's the first thing that Jesus does before they even have the meal?
Washes their feet.
Washes their feet, yeah. Which is really probably the ultimate symbol of some sort of servanthood and leadership. He warns of the coming temptations and dangers. Paul lists some of the ways that he has suffered for the faith, and then informs the elders that now they must be prepared to take on that same suffering, which I think echoes some of the teachings of Jesus at the Last Supper, or certainly in the days and weeks leading up to it, as he prepares his disciples for that. And again, he goes back to talking about servant leadership, particularly in verses 34. I wrote in my notes verses 34 to 25. That doesn't make any sense. Let's see.
He's saying that he has worked, so presumably
Yeah.
he's been doing his trade as a tent maker or sail
Yes,
maker.
yes. Yeah, I have not wanted, this is in verse 33, I've not wanted anyone's silver or gold or clothing. You, you yourselves know that I have worked with these hands of mine to provide everything that my companions and I have needed. I have shown you in all things that by working hard in this way, we must help the weak, remembering the words that the Lord Jesus himself said, there is more happiness in giving than in receiving. And so obviously, that's a direct quote, from Jesus, and so many of his teachings about just, they're so contrary to the way the culture in those days, the way the culture in our time understands those principles. And in fact, there's a quote from Will Willimon, who wrote one of the commentaries that I've been reading. And he makes the observation, he says, there's a marked difference between the way that the world judges leadership and the way that leadership is sought in the church. And I think that's important to think about, that the leadership that we are called to model as ministers, as elders, as disciples, is one of service, which is not the way usually that it works in business or finance or the real world, as it were. So Paul is offering that similar worldview to his followers in the way that Jesus offered it to his disciples. The other interesting thing that Paul does is he offers himself as an example of that leadership. Now, Jesus would have done the same thing. That's the whole foot washing thing. That Jesus embodied, and certainly other aspects of his life and ministry, but Jesus embodied that that way of servant leadership and acted it out in the foot washing and in other examples. Paul says, Paul sets himself up as an example. That's some of what I just read. I took care of myself, I funded myself, I've taught you, I've given everything to this ministry. And if you look over on page 209, we're going to look at one of Paul's letters. This is 1 Corinthians. Chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. Actually, it's primarily verse 16. I beg you then to follow my example. He says, I've become your father by bringing the good news to you. I beg you then to follow my example. So how many of us would feel confident in giving ourselves as an example to others?
No.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult burden to take on. And Jesus obviously would make that argument. Paul makes that argument. I think we could probably have a long discussion about, are there other, can you think of other people, again, not trying to put them on the level of Jesus or anything like that, but who can you think of in sort of modern terms that might be someone you could point to as an example, as someone who could model that? Mother Teresa, yeah. I think there's a few.
Mandela.
Nelson Mandela,
Yeah.
certainly, yeah.
Not Donald Trump,
Probably not Donald Trump, no. So here's a slightly longer passage from Will Wilman, but I think it's an interesting perspective he offers on this. And talking again about Paul's example and Paul's willingness to point to himself as an example of righteousness or devotion or holiness or whatever. Wilman says, when it comes down to it, without examples to follow, Christians really have very little to offer to the world. Jesus did not come preaching a new philosophy. He came preaching a new way of living and dying. Holy ideas were not his main concern, at least in the light of Luke and Acts. Holy people were the subjects of his teaching and witness, people who, in the words of Paul, had been built up and sanctified. Examples of holy living and dying make a great difference to the church in every age. If we Christians are unable to point to some Teresa of Calcutta or Desmond Tutu or Martin Luther King Jr. or Paul, we have very little to preach. The world is quite right in assuming that if the gospel of Jesus is true, it will receive embodiment in the lives of the people who follow Jesus. Lacking such people, we turn the Christian faith into an intellectual problem, a matter of academic debate, a thing of deep, inarticulate emotion, or some other invisible exercise which excuses us from the task of making people who really do look, think, and act differently from the rest of the world. It's a big ask, yes, it is, yeah. But I think it reinforces both the challenge of what Paul is trying to do and realize, and I think it really raises the bar in what it means when he points to himself as an example. So, so one of the things that popped into my mind, if you'll humor me for a minute, I'll play it for you, is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with, Wilman mentioned Martin Luther King Jr. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the last speech that he gave on the night before he was assassinated. Yeah, and I thought a lot about it even before I read that commentary, just in reading that text and thinking about, Paul knows enough to know he's not going to see these people again, but he doesn't probably know his immediate fate. Martin Luther King certainly didn't know he was going to be killed the next day, but the way that he ends, and this is only about a minute or so long clip, the way that he ends his speech reminds me a lot of Paul's speech. And so just play it here just as a way to maybe hear it in a more modern context. So this is, King had gone to Memphis, Tennessee. He was still involved in the civil rights movement, but he had founded what was called the Poor People's Campaign, and he was campaigning not just for against racial inequality, but also economic and social inequalities. And so he had gone to Memphis. There was a industrial action going on by the sanitation workers, who were largely or exclusively black. And he had gone to this rally to offer encouragement and draw attention to that. So this is just the very end of his speech.
I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life, longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
So it's pretty powerful to think about it in that, knowing that context and knowing the story that goes around it, and think about what that kind of does to us emotionally, not being directly connected with any of those events in particular, and then kind of read that back into what Paul is doing here and what he's talking about, and the context in which he is giving his instruction and direction. I think when I listen to that and when I read Paul, there's kind of a hopeful resignation in that they've moved past that point where probably all of us are from time to time about worrying about what's going to happen and worrying about what's to come next and worrying about this and that and all the other things that weigh on our minds all the time, and have moved to a place where I'm just going to go where God leads me to be and do that. So, sorry for a little detour there, but I think it helps to make those connections and see, again, not putting MLK on the same pedestal as Jesus or Paul, but seeing them as people of faith who did embody certain aspects of those teachings. All right. So, after he has his meeting with the Ephesian elders, there's some other traveling going on, short little snippets of communities that he visits. But ultimately he arrives in Jerusalem. So there's a couple of things that happen. First is he visits James, who we established earlier has kind of stepped up as the leader of the Jerusalem church. And it appears they convene the elders or the council or whatever sort of leadership body is there in Jerusalem. And they hear Paul's reports of what he's been doing, and they celebrate with him. And then there's a couple interesting things that happen. What happens during that meeting?
They sort of question him, don't they? It can't be true what
Yeah.
people are saying about how
It's
you're
kind of
saying
a
men don't have to be circumcised, etc., etc.
it's kind of a passive aggressive.
Come and prove that that's not true.
Yeah. Well, so they raise. Again, it reminds me of some modern day thing we see in our politics, that, well, a lot of people are saying that you do this, you know. Paul obviously defends himself in that regard. So as a council, they recommend two things. One, that Paul undergo this ritual purification, which will physically demonstrate to people that he really is devout, and he really, you know, it toes the line with all this. And then they basically tell him about the letter that they wrote all those chapters ago, the last time Paul was in Jerusalem. Do you remember that? They wrote to, it was the church in Antioch that was having issues between the Jewish members of the community and the Gentile members, and whether the Gentiles had to be circumcised to be part of the group. And so they basically tell him, oh, well, we've written this letter, this is what you should do. Now, it's kind of odd, I think, that comes up again, because according to Luke, I mean, Paul was present in that meeting when that letter was drafted, and then was present in Antioch when they came and presented the letter to the community there. So, so there's a couple of possibilities of why that letter reoccurs here. It's possible that they were reiterating that because Paul's companions that he was traveling with, which, if you've noticed in the description, there's more people around him now than there once were, that they may not have been aware of the decision of the council. It could be because Luke, as an author, is relying on different source material, and whatever report he was relying on for this particular scene before the council included that, and he just included it over. But I think more likely it's probably there because in restating that letter, it really exonerates Paul, because the reader knows that Paul has been faithful to those instructions, that Paul has honored the decision of the council and has adhered to that. And so at least as the reader, you hear that letter again and you think, well, okay, he's fine. He hasn't done anything wrong. So I think that's one possibility. But I think one of the interesting things it points to is some of the inconsistencies within Acts that we've seen. And there's, well, when we first read about the original Jerusalem Council from which this letter came, we looked at Galatians, at Paul's letter to the Galatians, where he talks about that meeting. And he doesn't mention a letter. He mentions kind of a different outcome of what happened. And so we have two different accounts there. But there are even inconsistencies even within just the book of Acts. And one of those is coming up because when Paul is arrested in Jerusalem, he's mistaken for an Egyptian troublemaker. And he's arrested, and when he goes to appear in front of the Sadducees and the Pharisees, he tells his conversion story. Anything jump out as being different about, because we've already heard that story once, early on in Acts. Anything different in the story this time around? And that would be in chapter 22, verse 6, on page 180. And this is probably unfair. We should probably read both of them together. Because they're not super significant differences, but they are different. So the original account of his conversions on page 161 in chapter 9. And so they start off the same. Saul is on the road to Damascus. Suddenly a light from the sky flashed around him. He falls to the ground and hears a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Paul asks who it is. The voice identifies himself as Jesus of Nazareth, whom you persecute. So in the original story, the men who were traveling with Saul stopped, didn't say anything. They heard the voice, but couldn't see anyone. In the later version, they didn't hear the voice, but they saw the light, right? No, but they didn't hear the voice. So it's just, there's little, I didn't make good notes on this, but there's a couple other minor little differences in the two stories. But I think, as I said, we also have discrepancies between what's in Acts and what is in Paul's own letters. Now, it's quite possible that Luke did not have copies of Paul's letters, but certainly seems to have had a good sense of who he thought Paul was, although some of the things that Paul teaches in Acts are not the same things that he talks about and teaches in his letters. Trying to find my note because I had another. I had another sort of little discrepancy thing I was going to talk about, but just thinking about in terms of, I think it's easy to look at these texts and find little things that are different or seem out of place or don't necessarily line up with each other. And I think part of it is remembering that the process of writing 2,000 years ago was probably a whole lot different than it is today. If we're writing a letter or a document of some sort and we get down here and, well, I'll put it in my terms. I mean, often I'll be writing a sermon and I'll come to make a point down here towards the end and I'll think, I don't know if that really matches up with what I said earlier. I mean, I can easily just scroll back up and make the change and it's done, but scrolling meant a whole different thing back then. And so it probably would have been a very different process. And so I think that's just one of the things that we have to live with, that there are things that are not always consistent in the text. All right. So back to the story. Paul is arrested. He goes before the Sadducees and the Pharisees. He has an interesting tactic in how he sort of disrupts that religious trial. Does anybody remember what he does that gets them all worked up?
He says he's a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee,
Yeah,
and he believes that the dead will rise to life, and that splits them because
yes,
Sadducees and the Pharisees believe different things.
that's right, that's right,
Yeah, they're sad, you see.
yeah.
Mm.
Very good, very good.
It's my vicar.
I'll have to remember that, I might use that
It's my
sometime.
vicar at All Saints.
Okay. They were sad, you see, yeah, okay, I like that.
That's something good to
Um,
Sorry about that.
So he gets kind of taken into custody by the Romans to protect him from what the different Jewish sects are wanting to do. How do those plans eventually get foiled? How does he get out of Jerusalem?
He's saying he's a Roman.
Well, he claims he's Roman, yes, yeah, he uses, and again, that's probably what the third or fourth time we've seen that now, that he identifies as a Roman soldier in order to affect a certain direction in his travels.
He tells the Romans there's a plot
Yeah,
to kill him.
his nephew finds out
Mm.
that there's a group that have vowed to kill him. They're gonna say they wanna question him some more, and so when they bring him out, they're gonna kill him. And so,
They send a lot of protection with him.
they do,
Yeah, 200
200.
soldiers, 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen.
yeah. And apparently that would have been about half of the regiment that would have been stationed in Jerusalem. So, yeah, a very significant military presence to protect him, to get him out of town, which I think is really, I don't necessarily doubt that happened, but it's just interesting to think about the level of protection they were providing for him, and it would be because he was a Roman citizen, I would assume, but, you think of sort of the really much more brutalistic culture in which they lived, it almost feels a little out of place, that they, the Romans, do whatever you wanna do, it's not our problem, sort of thing, just don't cause us problems. But anyway, they ship him off to Governor Felix. So there's a little background that's helpful, I found helpful to understand about Felix and some of the sort of interesting stuff that happens once he's in Felix's custody. So Felix is married to I've forgotten her name. Yes, Drusilla. And so it's important to know that so it's a second marriage, and get this right, she was the daughter of Herod Agrippa and had been married to some other lower level royal in that region. Felix, who had quite a reputation as a ladies' man, decided he really would like to marry her, and so forced the dissolution of her previous marriage so that she was then eligible to marry him. And I think Felix in general was just seen as, from historical accounts, not really very enamored with the idea of being governor and being of status, of his title and all of the perks that went with it, and not really so much concerned about the governing part of it. And Wood, after he was removed or sent back to Rome, would be, ultimately was never tried, but was, charges were put up against him for mismanagement or not fulfilling his obligations or whatever the particular wording of it was. But, so it helps to know that a little bit, that to have Paul come and preach to you and your wife about, I mean, Paul's probably teaching virtues and ethics and all these sorts of things, and having the background and the behavioral pattern that he did probably accounts for why he got uncomfortable and would send him away. He was basically waiting for Paul to give him a bribe to let him out, is what happens. And I think it even says as much in here that he was waiting for Paul to make a payment to him. So it winds up that Felix stages another trial. The group from Jerusalem come up and bring their attorney with them. There's really no resolution that comes out of that, because it's essentially a religious argument in a Roman court, and the Romans don't have or want anything to do with that, but because he's a Roman citizen, he's kind of stuck in this position. And he winds up spending 2 years with in custody with Felix until he is succeeded as governor. And Felix leaves him in prison because he wants to garner support from the local Jewish community that are underneath him. That's a lot. That's a lot of stuff going on. But I think we can see some of those patterns emerging as Luke paints Paul in the light of Jesus as a sort of earthly successor to Jesus in a way, or the extension of Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles, which we can have another conversation about in the future. But I think it's, if you just read the book of Acts, you might be tempted to think that Paul would be regarded as the founder of the church in some ways because of the work that he did. But instead, we get Peter, right? Not to poo-poo Peter at all, but, you know, Peter gets that claim because of the blessing that Jesus gives him about, you know, from you, or on this rock I will build my church. And Peter certainly, in the early pages of Acts, is the leader, is very active, and certainly plays an important role in that. But I think it's just interesting how the narrative changes and how the focus turns. There's much more focus on Paul in Acts than there really is on Peter, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, because Luke was with him.
Well, Luke may have been with him, so that's part of it,
So
yeah.
that's what we understand.
Yeah, yeah.
Therefore, you know, it's more of a personal account
Yeah.
that Luke was able to tell, which he couldn't do of Peter.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. It's interesting just in the ways that it, we go into a whole thing about Rome and all that, but it's just interesting how those tradition doesn't always directly reflect the text in the way that we like to think about it. Any questions or observations? Did I bore you? It's,
Open up all sorts of things.
So I do have a piece of music to play today, and we'll listen to it. I don't think I've used this with Bible study. I've used it at one of our evening communion services before. It's hard to find music on Acts chapter 22, it's just, there's not a lot out there. So this is not necessarily about Acts, but it came to my mind in reading, especially Paul's address to the Ephesian elders, when I think in some ways he's trying to kind of defend his record in a way. He's done all these things, now it's on them. He wants satisfaction that what he's done is going to make a difference. And so this song is called Your Labor Is Not in Vain. And I'll play it and we'll listen to it, and we'll wrap things up next week.